Okay.
Good morning, Professor Chomsky.
Hey.
Hi, we're very happy to have you speak with us this morning. We're from Vistamar School in El Segundo, California. We've got a great audience of people who are excited to hear your thoughts, and thank you again for taking the time to speak with us.
Glad to be with you.
Excellent. So I guess I'll just open it up for questions. I'll kind of be the traveling man with the mic, and we'll just jump right in if that's okay with you. Excellent. Everyone's up.
Hello, Professor Chomsky. I just want to say thank you for meeting with us. I'm extremely honored. First question is, how can libertarian socialist youth influence change by direct action and education in their communities?
Well, same way other activist groups have done it. Pick the one you want. The civil rights movement, the women's movement, the environmental movements, the anti-war movement, all face the same problem. All back, as far back as you want to go, abolitionists, others, you have to try to organize. First of all, you have to educate yourself. That's the beginning, and others. And that's an interactive process. It's not you're teaching them something. The interaction, everyone learns from it, just like a good educational system. So you have to, it begins with the process of organization and interaction. But once you have organization, you have to think about policies that can be pursued, actions that can advance your goal. There's no kind of formula for that. It depends on circumstances. It could be action in the streets, could be political action, boycotts, all kinds of things. Then you just continue to pursue this. I mean, there really is no, you look at the history of movements that have an impact, and there are plenty of them. The country's a lot more civilized than it was, say, 50 years ago or 100 years ago. These are the ways you can proceed. This hard, dedicated work, but no secrets and no formulas.
Thank you.
Thank you.
One more question. What is your response to those who argue that given how many people believe there is no alternative to neoliberal capitalism at worst and social democracy at best, surely in order to persuade people of libertarian socialism, we need to offer a somewhat detailed positive vision of how our society and economy would be organized?
Well, actually, first of all, I don't agree with the premise. I think that people are overwhelmingly dissatisfied with the impact of neoliberal state capitalist policies. In the United States, it's simply overwhelming, but I think the same is true in the rest of the world. That's why there are protests and uprisings against it everywhere. That's easy to understand why. You take the United States, the richest, most powerful country in the world, is in world history, in fact, incomparable advantages. There are tens of millions of people who can't find work. Huge numbers have just dropped out of the labor market because they've given up. If you take a look at unemployment figures, they seem to be kind of stable, maybe even slightly declining, but that's almost entirely due to the fact that people are dropping out of the workforce. So a huge number of idle hands, plenty of resources. The corporate profits are going through the roof. The big banks that were responsible for the current crisis are richer and bigger than ever, thanks to taxpayer bailouts and other such government aid. There's a huge amount of work that has to be done. You can't drive through a city without seeing signs of infrastructure collapse, for example, that are overwhelming. There aren't enough services are in decline. I mean, you could take a high-speed train from China to Kazakhstan, but not from Boston to Washington. The health system is an international scandal, about twice the per capita cost other countries and pretty poor, relatively poor outcomes, comparable to countries, and on and on. So huge amount of work to be done, enormous resources, idle hands, pleading to have a chance to do it, and the system is so rotten it can't put them together. Plus the fact that for the large majority of the population, for the last generation, since roughly Reagan, incomes and wages have pretty much stagnated, often declined. The benefits have declined. There's a lot of wealth produced, but in a ridiculously small number of pockets. I mean, a fraction of 1% of the population is getting most of the wealth. People aren't really doing anything useful for the society. In fact, most of it's harmful. And people are aware of this. That's why approval of Congress is in single digits. And polls show people are angry about every other institution. Banks, corporations, every aspect of government, just tremendous alienation and disaffection. So I think there's plenty of opposition to, and it's the same in other countries, to the very harmful effect of the neoliberal assault on the population over the past generations. In some regions of the world, there's been a real uprising and overthrow of a lot of South America in particular. And for the first time in 500 years, South America has pretty much freed itself from Western domination. The last century or so, U.S. domination is beginning to face some of its internal problems to integrate, and so on. It's a major change, historical change. What kind of a vision do you need of libertarian socialism? Well, I don't, there are some people, friends of mine, who think you really have to spell it out in detail, how will the society work? I'm less convinced of that for several reasons. For one reason, I don't think we know enough to spell out in detail how societies ought to work. There's a lot has to be learned by experimentation and trial. But a second reason is you can do things right now that lead you in that direction. You can build institutions of a future society within the present one. And it's happening. So take, say, the growth of worker-owned enterprises throughout a large, it's going on in large parts of the old declining Rust Belt around northern Ohio and so on. The growth of cooperatives, local farming, reliance on local produce and so on. These are all, it goes on and on. These are all elements of a future society, and they can be developed right now, and people can proceed to see the advantages of participating in it. So I really am not convinced that, maybe it's kind of like an academic exercise. You can spell out in detail a picture of a future society, but I don't think that's going to reach people for several reasons. For one thing, it's kind of arbitrary. There are a lot of things we don't know. And for another, it's kind of abstract. It doesn't relate to actual life. And there's a lot that can be done that does relate to actual lives.
Thank you very much.
All right, hold on. So why don't you say your name and grade and stand up.
Hi, Professor Chomsky. I'm a senior. And my question is, what is your view on the current oil crisis and America's role in it?
Oil crisis? Did you say oil crisis?
Yes.
Yes.
Well, it's the use of, let's generalize it to fossil fuels. The use of fossil fuels is almost certain to destroy the prospects for decent survival. It's only a question of time. There's almost no disagreement about this among qualified scientists. The latest reports of the IPCC, the International Commission on Energy, which is quite a conservative group, have just come out. Their prediction is under the current tendencies of about a 3-foot rise in sea level over the next century, by the end of the century. There are many scientists think that's much too conservative. It might be a 6-foot rise. Let's simply take a look around the world and see what that would mean. For countries like, say, Bangladesh, it would be kind of almost genocidal. For Boston, where I'm living, most of it would be underwater. And it continues around the world. The ones who will suffer worst, as always, are the poorest and the least advantaged. And that's only a piece of it. I mean, by now the predictions are consensus predictions that within maybe 50 years, what we now regard as the hottest seasons, really impossible to, hard to deal with, will be the coldest season. The effect of that on life, on ecology, on agriculture, on almost anything you can think of will be beyond anything that's ever happened in human history. And that's the result of continued use of fossil fuels. The contribution of the U.S. to this is highly significant. First of all, given U.S. power, which is actually enormous, incomparable, if the U.S. doesn't take the lead in doing something about it, nothing much is going to happen. So, for example, Germany, which is a highly productive and very successful, economically successful society, much more so than ours in some ways, though not on our scale, it is moving towards sustainable energy. Not too far. We're doing almost nothing. The United States is practically the only, among roughly 100 relevant countries, the U.S. is the only one that doesn't even have national standards on the use of fossil fuels. There's some suggestions for the national standard. And in general, the U.S., as you know, refused to sign that Kyoto Protocol, and is kind of dragging its feet on other international treaties. So we're actually, and in fact, there is now bipartisan consensus and enthusiasm in the media and elsewhere too on what's called 100 years of energy independence, using tar sands, fracking, other devices. First of all, energy independence is an almost meaningless concept. The energy, the oil that's produced just goes into an international market. And there isn't the slightest indication that the U.S. would ever be deprived of what's available in the international market. In fact, perfect access to it. So energy independence is basically a fraud. The Keystone Pipeline, for example, is not going to contribute at all to energy independence, even if it's functions. The Canadian oil, will go to refineries in Louisiana, where it will be sent out internationally, just as Alaska oil goes to Asia and so on. That's the way the international market works. But there's something more. 100 years of energy independence means 100 years of trying to get every drop of hydrocarbons out of the soil, and that's going to accelerate the disaster that's threatening. So 100 years of energy independence means let's race forward as fast as we can to fall off the cliff, like the proverbial lemmings. And you have a kind of, if there's ever any future historians, it's not obvious that there will be, but if there are, and they look back at this era, they're going to see something pretty intriguing. In the lead, there's general consensus that we're facing a very serious problem, maybe extremely serious. And there are two ways of reacting. One way is to try to accelerate the rates of destruction. The other way is to try to mitigate it and prevent it from happening. And if you look around the world, societies differ. In the lead in trying to accelerate the disaster are the richest and most privileged countries, the United States, Canada, a couple of others. In the lead in trying to do something about it are what we call primitive societies. All around the world, indigenous societies are struggling for what they call rights of nature. So in countries that have large indigenous populations, like say Ecuador and Bolivia, they actually have now legal, sometimes constitutional constraints on impinging on rights of nature. In Ecuador, the indigenous populations have pressed the government to keep, they have a lot of oil, to keep it in the ground where it ought to be. There are poor countries, so they asked for some support for this from the rich countries. They didn't get it. They didn't get the support, so now they're almost compelled to do what they don't want to do and develop their oil resources. The same thing's happening almost everywhere in the world. In Canada, it's the First Nations, the Aboriginals, the indigenous societies, who are in the lead in trying to prevent the very destructive use of exploitation of tar sands. In India, there's practically a war going on, a serious war between indigenous populations in much of the country and developmental projects of the government seeking to extract energy, minerals, and so on, which will devastate the environment. So you have this odd paradox of the least developed, the least what we call advanced societies in the lead in trying to preserve conditions for decent survival for your children and grandchildren. On the other hand, you have the richest, most powerful society marching forward to try to harm these prospects. So where does the United States stand in this? Not in a position that future generations are going to respect, quite the opposite.
Hello, Professor Chomsky. My name is Zach, and I'm a senior. And my question is, do you see a Malthusian collapse happening in our lifetime? Do you see a Malthusian collapse happening in our lifetime?
Malthusian?
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
Well, I mean, there are serious problems of the exploitation of finite resources. But the Malthusian problem specifically had to do with population. And it's not clear that that's in itself a great problem. There are known ways and effective ways to limit and even in fact reduce population growth. There are two ways of approaching it. The one way, which was used in China, was by force. So force people to have this the one-child policy. Try to coerce the population, keep the one child. That's an ugly way of doing it. There's another way which is more effective, in fact quite humane, and that's education of women. It's been shown overwhelmingly that independent of wealth, poor countries, rich countries, where there is education of women so that women have choices, fertility declines. In fact, in parts of the world where education of women is proceeded quite far, let's say Western Europe or Kerala, poor provinces, states of India, fertility is actually, the population is actually declining. Same in Japan, the population is declining. And that's a very, it's worth, obviously, it's great value in itself, but quite apart from the inherent value, it also has the effect of reducing population growth of the population. And that, there's every reason to think, I think, that could overcome the specific Malthusian concern over population growth. The other concerns about the race for the exploitation and destruction of finite resources, that's revealed. That's a very good recent book on this by Michael Clare, titled one of the main international specialists on this topic, estimating the availability of resources, oil, which was mentioned, but also copper, tungsten, many others. And of course, the role of finite.
Great, thanks. Got a couple more questions up front here. All right, here.
Hello, Mr. Chomsky. My name is Lauren Schweitzer. I am a junior here at Vista Mar, and I was wondering, what do you think of the whole Palestinian-Israeli conflict, and how do you think we could solve it?
Well, take a look at what's going on for the last roughly 35 years. There is an overwhelming international consensus on how to resolve it, at least in the interim term, maybe not the final settlement, but for the foreseeable future. That's a two-state settlement on the internationally recognized border, perhaps with minor and mutual modifications of the border. That's official U.S. policy up until the mid-70s. And by now, that's essentially universal. The third world, the non-aligned countries, which most of the world, the Arab countries, even have a more accommodating position, the Organization of Islamic States, which includes Iran. And this has been on the international agenda officially since January 1976. And that month, the three major Arab countries, Egypt, Syria, and Jordan, have brought a resolution to the Security Council of the United Nations calling for a settlement, a two-state settlement of the international border, and then it went on to use the standard terminology, guarantees for the rights of every state, including Israel and a new Palestinian state, to exist in peace and security with secure and recognized borders. Well, what happened to that resolution? The United States vetoed. Israel refused to participate in the conference. Same thing happened in 1980. U.S. vetoed a similar resolution. By that time, since the U.S. was not going to permit anything to happen in the Security Council where that's the veto, the issue shifted to the General Assembly where there was no veto. And if you look over the record, year after year, there are similar resolutions with numbers like 150 to 3. The three are the United States, Israel, and maybe Dominica, some Pacific island that the U.S. state will pick up. And that's been the record from the mid-70s to the present. And in fact, and it continues. The most recent U.S. veto, which did raise some eyebrows, was in February 2011. There was a resolution brought to the Security Council calling for implementation of official U.S. policy. Official U.S. policy is that there should be no expansion of the settlements in the occupied territories. Actually, it's a pretty minor issue because it's the settlements that are illegal and in violation of international law. Expansion just makes it worse. But official U.S. policy is that you shouldn't expand the settlement. That was the Security Council resolution. The U.S. vetoed. That's February 2011. And so it continues. As long as the U.S. leads the rejectionist camp, refuses to accept the international consensus, it's not going to be resolved. There is now, the discussion that's going on today, I think, is quite misleading. What's presented on all sides, Israel, Palestinians, international commentary, is that there are two options. The one option is the international consensus, two-state settlement. The other option is Israel takes over all of Palestine, and then there'll be a civil rights, there'll be, from the Israeli point of view, that'll lead to what's called the demographic problem. Too many Arabs in a Jewish state. From the Palestinian point of view, and point of view of many activists, that's a good outcome because it'll lead to a civil rights struggle, anti-apartheid struggle, and so on. But this is a fundamental flaw in this reasoning. Those are not the two options. The second option, Israel taking over the whole territory, it's not an option. Israel will never do it. The U.S. won't allow them, won't support it either. They have a better option, a third option, and it's developing right before our eyes. It's not a secret. Just take a look at what's happening. Israel is now carrying out systematic policies with U.S. support, which are taking out of which are first of all keeping Gaza under a very harmful, brutal siege, separated from the West Bank, And in the West Bank, what Israel's doing is taking over whatever's of value. We know, we can see what it is. It's the areas near the border, which are basically the pleasant suburbs of Tel Aviv and Jerusalem, on hills and so on. The main water resources, arable land, the Jordan Valley, which they're now developing, kicking out Palestinian villages and so on, and corridors running through. A corridor to the east of Jerusalem, first of all, expanded way beyond where Jerusalem ever was historically. And there's a corridor to the east of Jerusalem, including another town, which was mainly built in the 1990s, which essentially bisects the West Bank, and two other corridors farther north, which cantonize it further. In these areas, which Israel is developing and will sooner or later annex, there are very few Arabs. And those few are mostly being expelled. So when this is integrated into Israel, there won't be a demographic problem, there won't be a civil rights struggle, and what will be left for Palestinians are scattered fragments. That's what's taking place right before our eyes. That's the second option. That's the alternative to the international consensus. So what will happen depends on people like you, literally. As long as the U.S. continues to pursue this policy, nothing's going to change. No one else in the world has the force to do anything about it. There are now negotiations going on, but the negotiations are a farce for two very obvious reasons. It's an interesting comment on U.S. intellectual culture that the media can't even report this. But just think for a second. The negotiations are under the auspices of the United States. The United States is not a neutral observer. The United States is a participant. It's a participant along with Israel in blocking the international consensus. I mean, it's as if Iran was asked to negotiate Sunni-Shia conflicts in Iraq. People would laugh. It's a participant. It's not a neutral observer. So that's number one. If serious negotiations were going on, they would be taking place under the auspices of maybe some state with some degree of international credibility, maybe Brazil, something like that. The second precondition that the U.S. and Israel insist on is that during the negotiations, expansion of the settlements must continue. That essentially says, okay, we'll keep on with the second option under the cover of negotiations. Chances that this will get anywhere are really slight. There happens to be a long story about it in the New York Times this morning, which basically says nothing seems to be happening. And why that should surprise anyone is kind of strange. But I think that's where the situation now stands, and has for a long time, for about 35 years.
I know we have a parent who wanted to get in a question here, so.
This might sound kind of random, but I would really like to ask your opinion on why you think there's this preoccupation with the apocalypse and with zombies right now in our culture.
Apocalypse, zombies, things like that.
Yes.
Well, I've never seen a real study, but my guess is that it's a reflection of fear and desperation. When it's a very frightened country. The United States is an unusually frightened country. And in such circumstances, people concoct, either for escape or maybe out of relief, fears that terrible things happen. Actually, the fear in the United States is a pretty interesting cultural phenomenon. It actually goes back to the colonies. Now, there are some good studies of it. So there's a very interesting book by a very good literary critic, Bruce Franklin. It's called War Stars. You might want to take a look at it. It's a study of popular literature, the kind of literature that most people read from the earliest days to the present. When it gets to the present, he shifts to television, things like that. Just kind of popular culture. And there are a couple of themes that run through it, which are pretty striking and relate to what you're raising. For one thing, one major theme in popular literature is that we are about to face destruction from some terrible, awesome enemy. And at the last minute, we're saved by a superhero or a super weapon, or in recent years, high school kids going to the hills to chase away the Russians, things like that. That's one theme that runs through constantly. And there's a sub-theme. Turns out that the enemy, this horrible enemy that's about to destroy us, is somebody we're crushing. So you go back to the early years, the terrible enemy was the Indians who were going to destroy us. I mean, the colonists were, of course, invaders. They were invading the continent. Whatever you think about the Indians, they were defending their own territory. But this is even in the Declaration of Independence. People read it every July 4th, but not many people pay attention to what they're reading. It's kind of like reading a prayer book, keeping your mind somewhere else. But if you read it and pay attention, there's some pretty remarkable passages. So one passage is a list of the bill of indictment against King George III of England, explaining why the colonists were revolting. One of them is, he unleashed against us the merciless Indian savages, whose known way of warfare is torture and destruction and so on. Well, Thomas Jefferson, who wrote that, and was a very great figure of the Enlightenment, knew perfectly well that it was the merciless English savages whose known way of warfare was destruction and murder, and were taking over the country and driving out or exterminating the natives. But it switched in the Declaration of Independence, and nobody comments on it for 250 years. That's another sign of the same concern. After that, it became the slaves. There was going to be a slave revolt, terrible slave revolt, and the slave population, the black population, was going to rise up and kill all the men, rape all the women, destroy the country. We've got to do something about that. Then it goes on through the centuries. It becomes modern times. Hispanic narco traffickers are going to come in and destroy the society, one thing after another. And these are real fears. That's a lot of what lies behind the extremely unusual gun culture in the United States. It's quite unique. Homicide, deaths by guns in the United States are way out of sight. There's a kind of hysteria about having guns. A large part of the population thinks we just have to have them to protect ourselves from who? From the United Nations, and from the federal government, and from aliens, maybe from zombies, whoever it is. But we just have to have guns to protect ourselves. Now, that's unknown elsewhere in the world. Maybe in, say, Syria, a country that's at war, you find something like that. But in a country that's not only at peace, but has an unusual security, and a great degree of freedom, that's quite remarkable. And I suspect that what you're bringing up is part of that. I think it's, much of it is kind of just a recognition at some level of the psyche that if you've got your boot on somebody's neck, there's something wrong, and that the people you're oppressing may rise up and defend themselves, and then you're in trouble. And another is strange properties that the country's always had of fear of invented dangers. There is a kind of a paranoid streak in the culture that's pretty unusual.
Professor Chomsky, I want to be respectful of your time, and I know we're kind of at the end of what we'd scheduled with you. Do you have time for any more questions, or should we call it here?
So my boss walks in, don't come down on my paper, so nothing's going.
Okay, why don't we do one more here?
All right.
Hi, Professor Chomsky. I'm Maxwell from 9th grade. And what is your favorite political model for a country and why?
My favorite political model is one that doesn't exist. I don't think there's any country in the world that's a model that we should aspire to. Every place you look at has positive and negative elements. So the United States, which has plenty of problems, also has many very positive elements. So I don't know any country where freedom of speech is protected to the extent that it is in the United States. That's very important. It's a fundamental right, freedom of speech, which incidentally is not in the Constitution, it's not in the Bill of Rights. A high level of protection for freedom of speech was established here in the 1960s in the context of the Civil Rights Movement. Rights are not what's written on paper, it's what's determined by the courts. And it was in the 60s that the courts established a high standard of freedom of speech, uniquely high. Actually, in the context of the Civil Rights Movement, it was a case brought by the state of Alabama against the Civil Rights Movement, where the Civil Rights Movement won the case, and that established it had its freedom of speech issue. And that went on, and it's protected. So that's a very positive thing. Now, there are other positive things. On the other hand, there are very negative things. I mentioned a couple of them. You take a look at, say, Europe. Europe has a uniquely high, especially Northern Europe, most of Europe, a uniquely high standard of kind of civilized treatment of people, health programs, free education. The country that has the highest ranking in the world in educational achievements, Finland, where tuition is free. In Germany, with very high standards, it's free. In fact, in most countries, tuition is free. The United States is very unusual in the extraordinary cost of higher education, way off the international spectrum. Even in Mexico, a poor country next to us, tuition is free. Well, and the same is true of health standards and others. So those are things to praise and aspire to. We could aspire to that. On the other hand, there's plenty of things wrong in Europe which are quite unacceptable. You look around the world, I think you find similar things. My own opinion, at least, is we should not be looking for models to emulate, but we should be asking how we can improve our own society. What should we try to construct in our own society? That's the real problem for us. I don't think we're going to find models in the world, characters in history, anything else, give us a model that we can pursue. Life doesn't work like that.
Thank you.
Thank you. Let's see. Up front here. All right.
Okay. Hi, my name is Ben. I'm a concurrently enrolled student in 12th grade as well as in college, and I was just wondering, when it comes to the Spanish anarchists, how did they manage to persuade the population of northern Spain towards anarchism? And could their methods be used in the modern day, or is it too obsolete?
Well, you're referring to the Spanish anarchist revolution in 1936, but it didn't begin then. This has been going on for decades in Spain. There were free schools, there were attempts to construct cooperatives, there were educational programs, there were uprisings, some of which were put down by force. There's been a lot of experimentation, and people sort of had the ideas in their heads. This is the way they wanted to live. They thought about it, they developed parts of it, they implemented parts of it. When the opportunity arose after the Franco invasion in 1936, it came into functioning kind of, it looks as if it was spontaneous, but it wasn't. It was prepared by decades of educational and organizational work, and that's how things get done. Same, they could be anywhere, it could be here. I mean, in fact, a lot of these ideas are very deeply rooted in the United States. So you go back to the early days of the Industrial Revolution, here in eastern Massachusetts, where I am. This is around the mid-19th century. For one thing, there was a very lively labor press. It was a period of very free press, much more so than ever since or before. So there was a labor press, there was ethnic press, a lot of participation in the press, and it's very interesting to read, especially the working class press. It was, a lot of it was written by, there were a lot of women involved, what were called factory girls, young women from the farms who were brought into the textile mills to be textile hands, and others, Irish artisans from Boston, a lot of people brought in. And the press, their press was extremely interesting. And it tells you a lot about what's deep in American culture. And in my view, just below the surface, I think it can come out at any time. They bitterly condemned the industrial system because it was taking away their freedom as free, independent individuals. It was taking away their culture. They had a pretty high culture, much more reading, the factory girls, maybe no formal education, were reading the best literature of the day, what we regard as classic, and so on. And in particular, they believed that the slogan was that those who work in the mills should own the institutions of production, should be in the hands of the workforce. That's the anarchist vision, and that's working class people in the United States in the 1850s. In fact, they opposed wage labor on the grounds that it wasn't very different from slavery. The only difference was it was temporary. Slavery was permanent. Wage labor was supposed to be temporary until you get to be free and independent. That idea was so popular in the United States that it was a slogan of the Republican Party. You could read advocacy of it in the New York Times. Abraham Lincoln advocated wage labor is an intrusion, a forced intrusion on people's rights. It turns them into a kind of temporary slaves. And the same idea is even more radical in many ways. Were developed in the rural community. Remember, it was mostly an agricultural country then, but there was a farmers' alliance, which actually began in Texas, spread throughout the South and the Midwest, which was the most radical democratic movement in American history. They created their own cooperatives. They wanted to free themselves from the control of the Eastern bankers. They tried to link up with the huge labor movement, Knights of Labor. And it was a major democratic movement, radical democratic movement. Nothing remotely like it since, the so-called populist movement. Well, all of this is deep in American history, and I think it's just below the surface in consciousness, and could be elicited by activist movements and circumstances like the ones I mentioned in Northern Ohio, developing worker-owned enterprises, which are spreading pretty successfully. So, but that's what happened in Spain. It was not spontaneous in 1936. It came from decades of work, organizing, attempts to create such systems, sometimes crushed, but it just was in people's heads by the time the opportunity arose. I'm afraid I really do have to go now. I'm being called for another appointment.
I thought that might be the case. Well, thank you very much, Professor Chomsky.